Hello, Elizabeth here, and today I'm going to show you how to hand embroider this merry and bright design on any knitted sweater. It has this merry and bright cursive text as well as a little Christmas light decal, perfect for the holidays. I'm going to walk you through everything step by step. I started with this knitted green sweater. I've had this sweater for about 10 years, so I'm just upcycling, but you can do this with any knit sweater. First, I created a guide for my embroidery on water-soluble embroidery paper. The package this was shipped in got damaged, which is why it's all crumpled up. Usually it would be nice and flat, but it's still usable, so I'm gonna go ahead and use it. I chose a cursive font I liked for the text in Canva. This one is called Together. I measured the space on my sweater and decided to make the text about 6 inches wide, so I resized the design on my computer screen to be 6 inches wide. Then I put my laptop at full brightness, turned down the lights in the room, and put the embroidery paper against the screen to trace the text onto the paper with a marker. Some other options are to print out a piece of paper with the text on it and use that to trace onto your embroidery paper, or some embroidery papers can actually be printed on directly from your printer, or you can just handwrite your own font on the paper. This is just what was easiest for me. Cut off any excess paper, but make sure you leave a bit of blank space around where you plan to embroider so it doesn't get too bunched up around the edges and mess up the placement. I did the same thing with a string of lights element I found in the Canva library, which I'm going to place under the text on the sweater. If you want, to be safest, you can use a water-soluble marker for this, but because the paper itself is water-soluble, I just used a regular washable marker. I would avoid using something harsh like a Sharpie just in case the ink sinks into your knitted fabric when you wash away the paper. I want smaller and more frequent Christmas lights on my string of lights than this design originally had, so I just traced the curly wire and then added my own dots where I want each of the lights to go. This paper has a backing you can peel off and stick the paper right onto your sweater. Make sure you have it placed exactly where you want it before putting a good amount of pressure into smoothing it out against the fabric so that it won't go anywhere while you're sewing. Like I said, I've had this sweater for a while, so it's been washed and dried many times. If your sweater is brand new, I would recommend washing and drying it first so that any shrinking that will happen is done and won't ruin your embroidery later. Once your guide is placed nice and secure, you're ready to start embroidering. I want my text to look thin and delicate, so I'm using a thinner white yarn. But if you want thicker text, you can use a thicker yarn for your stitches for a bolder result. I cut a long piece of my yarn and tied a knot on one end, leaving a bit of a tail to weave in. I threaded the other end of the yarn through the eye of a darning needle. This can be a bit challenging. My trick is to use the pointy side of the needle to fray the tip of the yarn, then fold those frayed pieces tightly over the needle, slide the needle out leaving a flat edge on the yarn, and then push that flat edge through the eye of the needle. You probably won't be able to use a thicker plastic yarn needle for this because you need to be able to break through that stabilizer paper as well, not just the knitted sweater. Starting at one end of my first letter, I pushed the needle through the inside of the sweater to the outside so that the knot and tail of the yarn are sitting on the inside of the sweater. I'll be using a basic chain stitch for this design. To create the chain stitch, push your needle back into the same spot you just came through from the inside and pull the yarn through until a small loop is sticking out the front of your sweater. Hang on to that loop so that you don't lose it inside. Then you're going to pass the needle back through to the front of the sweater a little farther down the letter, making sure it comes up inside that loop. Then pull your yarn all the way through to secure the loop in place. You may need to pull and adjust it a bit until the loop is sitting nicely. Then, once again, you're going to stick your needle back into the spot you just came out of, pull through until a loop is left sticking out of the sweater, grab the loop and bring your needle back up a little farther down the letter, making sure it comes through the loop to secure it in place, and you're going to continue doing this all the way across your letters to create the chain stitches. The distance you travel for each stitch is going to depend on the size of your text and the size of your yarn. Because my yarn is thinner and I want a more delicate look, I'm keeping my stitches pretty short. If you're using thicker yarn, a 1/2 inch per stitch is probably a good rule of thumb, and you can even go through with a measuring tape and mark where each stitch needs to come up in order to keep it perfectly consistent. I just eyeballed mine. Make sure you're adjusting each stitch to look nice and sit tight and secure before moving on to your next one. Once you move on to the next stitch, you can't really go back and adjust any previous ones, so it's important to make sure they all look nice as you go. Now that I'm in the middle of this M letter, I want to end my line here and start again where the second arch begins instead of working my way back up with the chain stitches. So after this bottom chain stitch, I'm going to push my needle back through just on the outer edge of the stitch and pull through to fasten it in place. Then I'm going to push my needle back through from the inside of the sweater up here where this second arch begins. And I'll continue creating my chain stitches as usual. I find it doesn't always look best to do one continuous chain. It can get three-dimensional and bulky, and sometimes it looks cleaner to stop and start again when a new line begins. Over here on this letter E, I'm going to do a bit of an overlap where the line intersects. To do this, I'm going to continue right up to the edge of my previous stitch, then take my next chain stitch up and over that line, finishing right up against the edge on the other side. And then I'll continue going as usual. There's another intersection of lines at the top of this letter R, so again I'm going to overlap with my loop-de-loop here. When doing these overlapping stitches, the yarn does end up sticking out just a little bit in those spots because there are two stitches on top of each other. Personally, that doesn't bother me, but if you don't want it to stick up like that, you could just leave an empty gap in that spot on the way over in the first place, so that by the time you get there on the way back, you're just filling that spot with one chain stitch instead of two that overlap each other. And now my yarn has mostly run out and is getting pretty short, so I'm going to fasten it off. To do this, I'm going back in just outside of the last chain stitch to fasten it down. Then I flip the sweater inside out. Next, I'm weaving the tail back through a few of the stitches I've already done, and then I'm going to split this yarn in half to give me two pieces I can tie together in some nice secure knots. And once those knots are tied, I'm weaving it through another few stitches and then cutting off the end of the yarn. And while I'm here, I'm also going to weave in the tail from the beginning of the yarn. If you left your tail long enough, you can thread it through your needle and do the same thing. Mine is a bit too short, so I'm just taking a very small 2mm crochet hook and using that to weave the yarn through a few of my stitches. And now I'm restarting with a new piece of yarn just like I did at the beginning, tying a knot with a tail, threading the yarn through my needle, and bringing it through back to front in the spot where I left off with my most recent chain stitch. And I'll continue working the rest of the letters in the same way. You're going to continue doing this for all of the text on the sweater, and I won't show you everything, but I will show you how I do a couple more of the trickier bits that are a bit different from the rest of the letters. So now I'm at the letter I, and I need to add the dot of the I. So I'm going back inside the sweater just outside the final chain stitch of the stick of the I to fasten it down, just like I've done before. And now I'm going to come back out of the sweater where I want the dot of the I to go. And I'm going to create one single chain stitch like we've been doing all along by going back into the same spot, then coming up just above it and passing through that loop. Then I'll go back into the sweater on top of the stitch to fasten it down. Now there's a small gap in the middle of my dot, so I'm going to come back up just inside of the chain stitch at the top. And then I'm going back into the sweater at the base of the chain stitch so that it fills in that gap and makes the dot look like a filled in circle. Then I'll come back through at the top of the I and continue working my way back down the letter. Now I'm at the letter G, and I want to stop here and jump up to the top of this letter to start a new line. So I'm going to fasten down the last chain stitch and make this jump to the top of the G. This will create a slightly longer stitch on the inside of the sweater when you make this jump, which is not an issue at all, just make sure you pull it through tight enough that there isn't any slack on the stitch. If you want it to be as clean as possible on the inside, you could fully fasten off here, weave in the tails, and then start again instead of making that jump. But I'm not bothered by the larger stitch, and I find it easiest to just continue on. And now I'm at the letter T, where I'll need to jump either to the bottom of the letter or the top of the letter to start a new line. I'm going to jump to the bottom end, partly because it's a shorter distance of a jump, and partly because once I get to the top, I'll be able to add that cross of the T after the rest of the letter is done, so it will sit on top. So I'm working backwards now from the bottom edge up to the top. Does this reverse the direction that the chain stitch loops are facing now because we're going the opposite direction? Maybe. Honestly, I cannot tell with my own eyes, so I am unbothered by it. But if you must jump to the top for your own satisfaction, I love that for you. You go ahead and do that. And once my T is crossed, my letters are done, so I'll fasten off and weave in my ends. And now I'm ready to move on to the string of lights. I peeled the backing of the design and stuck it onto the sweater just below the Merry and Bright text. I used the same thin white yarn with the same chain stitching and embroidered the wire of the string lights, overlapping my stitches in the places where it loop-de-loops. The last step was to add on the Christmas lights. I used orange, yellow, green, and pink yarns for the Christmas lights. Okay, my technique here gets a bit weird. I'm no embroidery expert, I just do what works for me. So what I did was for each of the lights, I did the same thing as I did when I dotted the letter I earlier. So I started with my yellow yarn, tied a knot in the end, and came up through the sweater where I want to place the first yellow light. I made my chain stitch, fastened it down at the top, came back up inside the stitch, and then back down again to fill in the little gap. And that's how I created the shape of each of the lights. This next part is where it gets a bit chaotic. I'm doing the same yarn color on every fourth light on my string of lights. So now I need to travel over to the next one. And to do that, I'm turning the sweater inside out and weaving my yarn through some of the string of light stitches I already created until I get over to my next spot. Then I'm coming back up through the sweater and embroidering the next yellow light. Then again, I'm turning the sweater inside out and following the path to the next yellow light, coming back up through the sweater and creating the third light. Doing the same thing one more time, creating the fourth and final light, and then fastening off my yarn and weaving in the tails as usual. Next, I created my pink lights, and I did the exact same thing, but when I weaved through the previous stitches on the inside of the sweater, I tried to choose some stitches that I didn't already go through with the yellow yarn, just to keep it a bit less bulky. And then I did the same thing with my green lights, again trying to take a different path of stitches. And finally, I did the same thing with the orange lights. So this is what my lights look like on the outside, which I'm quite happy with. But it does look a little bit chaotic on the inside of the sweater. It's nice and secure and none of my stitches are going anywhere. And this sweater is just for my own personal use, so I'm completely unbothered by this. But if you do plan to sell or gift yours to somebody else, you might want to do a fresh piece of yarn for every one of your lights and then fasten off and weave in your tails for every single one. I simply cannot be bothered to do that 15 times because I don't care that much. But if you can be bothered, I love that for you. You go ahead and do that. Finally, I trimmed off a bit of the excess embroidery paper around the edges of the design. Then I ran the whole thing under warm water for a few minutes to fully dissolve the paper and leave just the embroidery behind. The paper will turn into a gel-like consistency and then dissolve off of the fabric. Then I ran it through my washer and dryer to remove any remaining residue from the embroidery paper. And here is the final result. I love how this turned out. I think it's such a cute sweater for the Christmas season, and it turned out exactly how I had envisioned. I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and if you enjoyed this video, I would love for you to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment letting me know what sort of projects you'd like to see in the future. See you later!